Hi, I'm Dr. John Tam, and my channel focuses on advice based on social science that will help you in your career. If that's what interests you, then please subscribe to the channel. Today I'm going to focus on Beth Harmon, the protagonist of the story Queen's Gambit. Now, just a quick heads up, there are going to be some spoilers because I'm going to break down the story from episodes 1 to 7. So if you haven't watched it yet, then definitely go watch it before coming to this video. Now, my analysis will be based on the Netflix show and not the book from the 1980s. The reason for this is because there would be inconsistencies in the analysis within the plot. So for example, in the book, Beth Harmon was actually the one who reached out to Jolene and not the other way around. Also, I want to be very clear that even though this character is fictional, I'm never diagnosing this channel, but just speculating what's happening in both a psychological and a sociological perspective. I want to begin with the moral of the story, and it's quite interesting that it's found in plain sight as a double entendre, which is a phrase with two meanings, in the title, and it could also be found in the last scene. And of course, the story is called The Queen's Gambit. The first meaning is to attack life with aggression. And The Queen's Gambit is an aggressive move to start a chess game to dominate the center board. It has a series of counters that can take people by surprise, and it's actually quite powerful, so much so that some people don't really consider it a true gambit since its upside is so huge. Specifically, it's white pushing its queen pawn forward, and then black pushing its queen pawn forward, and then it's white's bishop pawn forward in order to take out the black's queen's pawn. And there are a lot of YouTube videos out there on, what the Queen's Gambit is specifically as a move, so I'm not going to elaborate on that. The second meaning is making a sacrifice, and that is what a gambit means, right? And that is a constant theme within the show. In her childhood, Beth's mom was sacrificing her. As she got older, she was sacrificing her social life to pursue chess. And as you can see, her desire to develop a sense of belonging and self comes up time and again throughout the whole show, especially when she is in her valleys. Perhaps the Queen's Gambit, though, is most obvious in the very last game, where she essentially sacrificed her queen and then pushed her pawn to be reborn as a queen, which then led to her victory against Borgov. And this whole sequence is fascinating because at the very beginning, Mr. Scheibel told her that you never sacrifice your queen. But at the end, she eventually sacrificed herself, which is the queen, to be reborn as a new queen. And this whole process symbolizes the rebirth and renewal within the game, which is a parallel to Beth's own story at the end. And who doesn't love a good old redemptive story, right? Redemptive stories go way back to mythology where, the phoenix dies and then rises from the ashes. That's a very traditional symbol in mythology. And it's one that has always stuck with humans because people can resonate with it so much. Like, everyone's made mistakes in their past and everyone wants a chance at redemption. And so, having established the theme of the story, I want to now move on to discuss the personality psychology of Beth. And I'm going to use the big 5 personality traits. If you're not familiar with it, I suggest you to take a quick and free personality test in the links below so you can get a better understanding of what it is. It may even be more fun if you guess what Beth's score is as well. Now, the big 5 personality traits follows the acronym OCEAN, and O stands for openness to experience, C stands for conscientiousness, E stands for extraversion, A is agreeableness, and N is neuroticism, and is rated on a continuum. So for openness to experience, I would say that Beth is obviously O++, which is very high. Obviously, to play chess at her level, you need to be extremely smart, extremely calculating, and to have precision and foresight in a way that is, really rare amongst other people. Also, her mom's got a PhD from Cornell, she's got a rich father, and wealth and education are commonly associated with high IQ, right? And in twin studies, you can also find that IQ can go from anywhere from 50% to 80% in heritability. Most recently, the studies on heritability of IQ has shown something called the Wilson effect. So basically, the older you are, the more you inherit the IQ. And so basically, if a child is very young and both of their parents are extremely intelligent, have a very high IQ, it may not really show in the child, especially if the developmental conditions aren't there to support it. But as the child grows older, the IQ actually becomes more apparent in terms of its heritability. This also somewhat applies to personality as well. Twin studies of personality also show a very large degree of heritability. And this also explains why she could visualize the chessboard on the ceiling, which is a constant theme within the show. When she was young, she may be very intelligent, but it was very inconsistent. And I almost feel like there's a false attribution to the fact that the two-color green pill, which is essentially a representation of Librium. The show never really says, what the tranquilizer is, but in real life, Librium existed in the 60s, and Librium was also a two-colored pill, right, with green and white. But basically, she attributed her ability to visualize the chessboard to the pills. And as she was taking it, she was still winning. But once she got to the highest level, it makes sense that, you know, taking those pills don't really help, because what it actually does is it fogs the mind up. And so at the very end, when she was playing Borgov and is able to visualize everything happening on the ceiling, it basically represented the fact that she never really needed the pills in the first place. In fact, it was probably her crutch. And so within the whole story of Netflix, the whole timeline is approximately a decade, a little less than a decade, but pretty much it was her coming into her own in terms of her intelligence as well. So when we're looking at high openness experience, we're talking about high imagination and intellect. She's got very high degree of artistic sensibility given her taste in clothing. She also leans towards psychological liberalism, which is the readiness to challenge authority, convention, and traditional values, which you can find in her challenge towards the state's position against communism, or Christianity's position against communism, and so on. Or even her childhood rebelliousness towards authority in the orphanage. Now for C and conscientiousness, I would say she's in the middle, and I would say she's a polarized middle. Now what I mean by polarized is that there are instances where she is super high in conscientiousness. She's super driven, she's super focused and determined, she's studious, she's hyper competitive, especially in chess. Right? However, other aspects of her life, she exhibits low self-control, substance abuse in drugs and alcohol, and she often ran late. And you can attribute that to the fact that there was a lot of stress in her competition. But at the same time though, those things broke out when there was actually no competition, when she was in her valleys after a big game. And so I would say she is polarized in her conscientiousness. Some aspects she is super conscientious. Some aspects she is super unconscientious. You put those two together, she's right in the middle. Now for E, trait extraversion, I would say she's actually an introvert. She is not friendly or gregarious. She can sometimes be assertive. However, only for some aspects of her life. She has a low activity level. You basically don't see her exercise throughout the whole show other than her occasional dance in her living room or playing squash with Jolene when things are getting better, and I'll talk about that in a second. She's excitement seeking, but only in her own world in her head rather than the real outside world, and you can see that throughout the show. For example, in Mexico City, she never really went out to check out Mexico, right? Or in, you know, Russia, at the very end, only when she was finally growing up and coming into her own was she willing to step out and really explore Russia. Also, she's not exactly the cheerful type, and she's kind of quirky in terms of her temperament, so I would definitely put her as an introvert, as an E-. For A, agreeableness, I would say she is disagreeable. She doesn't really mind a challenge. She is hyper competitive. She's sometimes trusting, sometimes not. It really depends on the individual, especially after the individual has won her trust. Outside of chess, she is not straightforward, and that's why I think the chess game itself is very fascinating, because she can be straightforward and she can go for what she wants. She's not exactly lacking in modesty, and she's low in sympathy, especially in the way she crushes others in chess. However, it is important to note that she does have a soft spot for certain people in her life, like Alma, Jolene, and Mr. Scheibel. At the same time though, she isn't really straightforward in articulating and expressing her appreciation for the other people other than Jolene at the very end. For N, trait neuroticism, I would say that she is N+. She gets angry during games. She is prone to immoderation at times. She can get quite depressed, and how she plays the game is a reflection of herself. And given her style, right, in the book, she is like Alakine, and she is known to be an attacker, a very aggressive attacker. At the same time, she also worries, and she copes fine for the most part, other than in major setbacks or when there are times in life where things just, you know, shake her up, like the passing of her mother or losing some big games. When you have a high degree of neuroticism, but you are also somewhat conscientious and introverted, you can come across as what we call a duck. So when I say someone's like a duck, it's kind of like they're calm above the water, but underneath the water, they are paddling like crazy. And that seems to be a constant theme for Beth. She's pursuing excellence. She's pursuing, you know, being number one in the world. And she's making sacrifices and essentially suffering for it. Neurotic people also tend to be self-conscious, and she does come across quite self-conscious at the beginning and cared about what other people thought of her. But towards the end, she kind of got over it, and that is actually one of the main victories that she has over herself. And so that's the personality analysis of Beth Harmon. Now moving on, I want to discuss some sociological analysis and some thematic things that are of interest in the story. Number one, I want to talk about this idea of breaking fate. Now the story makes it quite clear that her mother is Elizabeth's foreshadowing. Super intelligent, but prone to self-destructive behavior. She's inherited her IQ and she's inherited her personality. In essence, the battle was never against other chess players, but it was always with herself. The chess players really didn't stand a chance once she figured herself out. And that's why the movie didn't really explain too much about chess, right? When you look at the show, the chess moves were all there, they were quick, you didn't really have time to watch and digest the moves. And in fact, looking at what the people have said about the show, essentially those moves came from real games. However, you never really learn chess. In fact, my wife left the show just as oblivious to chess as she did walking in. And I was actually hoping that she would, watch the show and be more interested in playing chess with me, but turns out that's not the case. And she's probably laughing her head off as she's editing this video. So the theme of the story really is about breaking fate and self-conquering and self-actualization. Humans learn coping mechanisms as a child, and Beth developed a front of resilience but never really learned how to cope. And so that was always the tenuous balance within the show. You never really knew if Beth was going to figure it out as she navigated those peaks and those valleys in her journey. The second point I want to talk about is in sociology, there is research on suicide, and self-destruction taken to its extreme essentially results in suicide. There is not much else you can do to yourself beyond killing yourself. And when sociologists look at the classic studies of Durkheim in suicide, one of the things that we find is that increasingly fragmented social relationships lead to increased loneliness, which lead to the proclivity towards self-destruction. And as you look at Beth's journey, that is a constant theme. When she began in her orphanage, her only relationship was really Jolene and Mr. Scheibel. And even Mr. Scheibel was somewhat cold. When she moved on to living with Alma, essentially her only relationship was with Alma. When Alma passed away, she, floundered, and eventually other people slowly slid in to fill that social gap, such as Towns for a very short time, or Harry, or Benny, but most importantly Jolene. And there are others who would drag her down, such as Cleo, who she herself admitted that she's a model and kind of like a shell that anybody can put anything on to make her look pretty. And essentially, Beth's involvement with Cleo somewhat led to her second defeat against Borgov. Of course, it wasn't the only reason. She wasn't fully ready yet, but she could have been much more ready walking in if she wasn't partying the night before. So essentially, social relationships matter. Having a close network of people who are supportive matters. And that's basically the main difference from the beginning of the show till the end. Beth really was able to, over time, develop a support group. Or she didn't really develop it, but people just naturally, flocked to supporting her. And that was really her major breakthrough. And time and again, when we look at sociology and social studies and just studies of happiness and loneliness and suicide, human relationships and real people who are supportive in communities really do make a difference. My third point is that personality and IQ isn't everything. Stress can break anyone. Beth was playing against the top competition. She lacked support. She needed to be challenged by her peers where, despite being an intuitive player, she really needed to win by learning structure at the end, but also depend on her intuition. It's not an either or kind of world, it's a yes and kind of world. Like I said before, social support really matters. Jolene took Beth to play squash, and when you exercise, you engage the body's parasympathetic system, which helps flush out the cortisol, which are the stress hormones. And you can essentially see Beth gaining that balance in health and in her life as well. And it really comes to show that most of the drama in your life, no matter on what cards you're dealt in terms of your personality, in terms of your IQ, or in terms of, the family structure you're in, a lot of the battles are with yourself. And at the end of the day, no matter how smart, talented, and gifted you are, you do need a supportive community around you to help you overcome the odds. And it really comes to show what Cambridge psychologist Brian Little says in terms of human influence, right? The things that are impacting human behavior. There's the biogenic traits, what you're dealt with biologically. There's the sociogenic traits, the social circle around you. And there's also the idiogenic traits, which are, the things that, the idiosyncrasies that happen to each individual person over time. And so, wrapping up, the series was about self-mastery and growth. Beth's heroic journey was her meteoric rise in Kentucky, facing the dumps after losing to Benny and losing to Borgov on top of Alma's death, rising again to beat Benny, and then going back down in the dumps again, losing to Borgov to the second time, and then finally with her final triumph of being reborn with the Queen's Gambit. And the key was pushing through her own limitations with the help of her friends who challenged her to be better and supported her to fulfill her dreams, and also for her to become more reassured in herself. and just establishing herself as an independent individual, saying no to Christian Crusade support and to the state's demands against communism. She essentially became herself. Borgov was really never the real enemy, as it showed in the end with him congratulating her. In fact, he probably kept her from self-destruction, because what would be next if she was to become a world champion without much effort and adversity, as she was talking to that child in Mexico? If anything, the story showed that chess was simple. It was a world with rules that can be dominated and controlled. When Beth failed to control the game, that was also when she failed to control her life. And that's why at the end, when she left the car to play with the old man in the park, it was about going back to her roots. She began playing the game with Mr. Scheibel in the basement in her orphanage out of love for the game, out of interest. Similarly, having beaten everyone in the world, she can finally have peace and go back to just enjoy the game rather than going on an eternal pursuit of scratching and clawing to be number one in the world. It's about being comfortable in your own skin and a coming of age story for a prodigy and the demons that haunts having a gift. And that's what makes her story so relatable. All of us have our own gifts and talents, but at the same time, we also have our own demons to face. And that wraps up my analysis for Beth Harmon in Queen's Gambit. If you haven't taken a free personality test, I highly recommend you to try it out in the links below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell for more updates in the future. Click the like and share with your friends. Take care.